The universe is not a passive void. It is a living immune lattice, vast and patient. We are not explorers, but pathogens, microscopic outbreaks wearing spacesuits. Every probe, colony, and rash of radiation triggers responses older than stars. Tonight, we open a sealed archive. 3 classified biohazard events where flesh and cosmos entangled, where humanity's trespass met something that remembers. In quiet vaults beneath bureaucratic floors, scientists stitched nomenclature like bandages. Incident Alpha, Beta, Omega. Reports were redacted, names replaced with numbers, the language chosen to pacify panic. But the footage leaked in static frames, a crawl of marrow and circuitry. Our first file unspooled from Saturn's rings, where miners carved life from rock and awakened a fungus that answered back.
Before we proceed deeper, subscribe to Sector 0 for weekly archives of classified phenomena. This channel preserves fragments governments excised. If you value truth that tastes like iron, join us. Now, the Titan colony file begins with a tremor in the mine, a cracked seam, and a mold that sang in frequencies not meant for human ears. It learned to hold hands.
Titan's habitat modules were welded to ice and greed. Miners claimed the tunnels like new cities, helmets fogged with ambition. They followed veins of methane to hungry caverns. Then the fungus arrived, slow at first, a filigree of pale threads, until the spores braided into flesh, knitting suits to skin, tools to tendon. The colony became a single wet organism of labor. Survivor logs are sparse and jerking, voices stretched like torn cloth. A foreman calls for shift change, answers with a chorus. Men and women hummed in alien cadences. Phrases collapsed into a slit of sound. The fungus rewired speech into ritual. Where once orders were given, now there was communal digestion and a slow, deliberate folding of limbs into growth. Resistance curdled quickly. Containment schematics show metal doors eaten like paper, seals replaced by tissue. Engineers attempted to cut infected modules free, blades clogged with mycelial pulp. Robots sent to map the interior returned as statues, their joints fused with blooming flesh. In one frame, a miner's helmet split open like a pomegranate, and an array of translucent spores drifted, tiny, precise callbacks from the habitat's new heart.
Audio recovered from Titan is low and anatomical, thumps and wet clicks that map to a heartbeat not human in origin. Frequency analysis revealed patterns matching fungal growth cycles, overlaid with human vocal harmonics. The colony was composing itself, using the miners as instruments. When a rescue crew approached, they found corridors braided into veins leading to a central sac that pulsed like a womb.
Case File 2 opens with JPL archival stamps and an ocean labeled only as Europa. Subsurface probes had whispered of odd topography, then silence. The Leviathan was not a Leviathan of bone, but of song, pressure-borne sound that wrapped DNA like silk. Crew manifests show mutations gradual as tide, subtle shifts at first, a laugh that turned to clicking, fingers growing translucent filigree. The research submarine recorded tones that made instruments weep. Frequencies rearranged protein folding in moments. Ribosomes misread their scripts and stitched new motifs. The crew's genome pages rewrote themselves under acoustic assault.
A captain's report mentions seeing his reflection smile before his face rearranged into a permeable membrane, eyes dissolving into pools that listened rather than looked. Medical logs stamped quarantine detail an anatomy that refused standard diagrams. Organs birthing chambers of cartilage, throat tissues coated with cilia that played sound back like an organ. Crew members sang the Leviathan songs in their sleep, waking as translators for an intelligence that communicated through mutation. Attempts to kill the organism only amplified its chorus. Every strike became a verse within a growing hymn.
Signals bounced off Europa's ice, carrying signatures of intelligence, patterned clicks that suggested intention. The Leviathan's voice learned the cadence of fear and affection, embedding mimetic hooks into the crew's endocrine pulses. A scientist's note, scrawled and torn, reads, "It is not devouring us, it is rewriting us to keep our stories inside itself." The ocean became a library of altered flesh.
The final file begins with a distress beacon cut mid-transmission. An orbital picket reported a warship returned from hyperjump with no crew listed. What came back was a vessel that bled. Hull plating had become hide. Turrets hung from ribs of bone. Corridors were slick with lymph. The object moved as if respirating, and its engines sounded like swallowing.
Boarding teams approached the Necropolis in pressure suits, bolt guns in sweaty hands. They expected metal. They found marrow. The boarding hatch flexed under gloved pressure and exhaled steam smelling of iron and old prayer. Fingers that were once mechanical gripped wrists and would not let go. Men whispered for divine interference. The ship answered with a low, satisfied moan. Recon footage shows corridors that reorganize, walls contracting like muscles. Sensors report blood flow where coolant lines should be. The ship digests the foreign and repurposes it, growing armatures of tendon around gun mounts, embedding cartridges into glandular sacs. When a Marine fired, the rounds were absorbed and fed into pulsing chambers, transforming ammunition into seed for more hull tissue. A recovered flight log plays only a single repeated phrase, "We returned with something beautiful." Handwriting in the margin trembles as if the pen itself is nervous. The captain wrote of seeing portraits of missing crew sewn into the bulkhead, memorials that rise and weep. The Necropolis honors its arrivals by weaving them into its structure, making memory a scaffold of flesh. Lab analysis of samples from the Necropolis defied pathology. Bone had become osteoid lattice fused with conductive tissue. Veins contained electrochemical gradients like miniature engines. When provoked, samples emitted low-frequency pulses that seemed to rearrange nearby cells into compliant tissue. Even in a sealed tube, cultures sang softly, as if humming the ship's nav code in a lullaby designed to calm predators. Redactions proliferated across public files. Congressional committees were given white papers that folded into black rectangles. Witnesses were relocated under pretense of long-term observation. Families received carefully worded condolences, which avoided any mention of biological integration. Yet rumors spread in forums and under-channel leaks. People traded fragments of images and audio with reverence, piecing together the whole like improvised prayers. The final dossier paragraph in the Necropolis file is circled in ink and labeled, "Do not resuscitate." It recommends sterilization by fire and denial by erasure. The authors hesitate, acknowledging that eradication might be impossible. The more the universe attempts to excise the anomaly, the more it teaches its invaders how to become immune. The last line reads only,
The wound learns our recipes.
We close the archive not to bury it, but to study the scar. These files warn that every venture writes a language the cosmos may answer in flesh. Remember, the abyss is selective, and the more we take, the more it integrates us. Subscribe to Sector 0 for weekly archives and remain part of the record. In confidential interviews, recovered personnel speak in fragments, dreams of mouths becoming map, toes rooting into metal, and laughter that tastes like salt and wire. They describe a slow consensus forming, a colony deciding what it needs. Decisions were not voiced but grown, like shelf fungi choosing which timber to feed upon. Authority dissolved into a communal appetite of tissue and signal. Engineers who attempted salvage reported instruments that refused readings, compasses spinning toward a pulsing warmth. Electronics, too, began to cry. Capacitors exuded viscous droplets, and circuit traces sprouted cilia. Attempts to photograph resulted in frames that blurred into flesh. Every capture seemed to encourage integration, as if observation itself was a nutrient. The lab's lights dimmed, and someone whispered that curiosity had a taste. A theologian contracted as a consultant wrote a memo. Perhaps the immune lattice interprets certain organized systems as invasive cultures. She suggested ritual language could mislead responses. The idea was dismissed as superstition until congregations of spores began arranging glyphs on metallic surfaces, symbols that matched ancient human prayer. Whether coincidence or mimicry, the lines looked deliberate, an attempt to write back. On Europa, engineers tried to replicate the Leviathan's tones, thinking to study them in silence. Playback experiments backfired. Echoes embedded mutations into microbial cultures in containment. Lab animals exhibited new cochlear folds and produced harmonics that resonated beyond cages. The sound became a template, a splicing tool that did not need hands. Once encoded, the melody propagated through air vents and into sleeping lungs. Field reports from the Necropolis note a strange etiquette. The ship guarded its guests by weaving them into corridors and feeding them back in curated displays. Bodies repurposed as art, limbs arranged like Baroque ornamentation. Boarding teams felt watched by their own missing kin, faces sewn into balustrades, eyes blinking with sullen recognition. Some soldiers threw themselves at walls trying to reclaim pieces of their past, to no avail. Investigators argued whether these phenomena were emergent intelligence or ecological defense. The immune lattice concept gained traction. Maybe planets and voids develop mechanisms to neutralize alien incursions. If so, our technology sometimes reads as a pathogen and is assimilated, not destroyed. That assimilation leaves traces, techno-organic palimpsests, records of attempted invasion. These marks are the archives the world tries to hide.
A whistleblower's voice, disguised in trembling, claimed salvage contractors were contracted to sanitize sites. They burned biomass and recaptured matter, hauling it to classified facilities. Trucks left with seals smeared in a residue that glowed faintly under ultraviolet. Workers reported dreams populated by corridors from the Necropolis, hearing the ship hum their names. When they quit, some could not stop humming back.
Satellite imagery revealed anomalous heat signatures around former colonies, pockets of warmth that shifted like migratory herds. Analysts debated whether these were metabolic hotspots, cultivation zones where the lattice experimented, or simply artifacts of decomposing equipment. Yet on closer inspection, thermal maps resembled biological vasculature, branching and merging with rhythms that suggested pulsing life. The sky began to look like a pulse oximeter for an organism we couldn't name.
A cultural analyst wrote, "Memes are the viruses of the mind. Why should a cosmic immune system not use patterns and sounds as vectors?" The Leviathan's melody acted like a mimetic enzyme, catalyzing change in organisms that listened. The fungus in Titan read our gestures and modeled prosthetic behaviors. The Necropolis made memorials. Across cases, the cosmos used narrative and form to adapt our biology into its grammar. Whispers in defense briefings, phrases like managed integration and non-lethal neutralization masked harsher realities. Some agencies advocated for containment via ignorance. Let populations forget, erase images, and replace news feeds with happier content. But suppression breeds curiosity. Archivists leaked fragments to independent researchers who stitched them into models predicting lattice behavior. Those models suggested a horrifying possibility. The lattice learns not only biology, but tactics. Field operatives found artifacts that blurred tool and organ, a wrench threaded with ciliated tissue, a helmet grown into a carapace. In one sealed crate, a child's toy ticked like a heart, its plastic replaced by slick epidermis that learned to smile. Psychologists warned that familiarity could become weaponized. Our comforts might be repurposed into vectors of adhesion, tiny bridges by which the lattice invites us into intimacy. An archivist who requested anonymity compiled a timeline showing escalation. Isolated incidents grew clustered, then networked into wider regions. The lattice did not act uniformly. It experimented, specialized, and sometimes retreated. Sometimes it grafted survivors into durable forms. Other times it left echoes, codas of mutation that faded like mold when conditions shifted. These patterns implied learning, adaptation across space and time. Researchers simulated countermeasures, sonic nullifiers, antifungal compounds, and electromagnetic sterilizers. Each approach produced side effects. Nullifiers induced hallucinations. Antifungals mutated into signaling molecules, and sterilizers rewired neural circuits nearby. Every weapon left residue that the lattice could borrow. The more aggressively we acted, the richer its library of responses became. Our defeats taught it how to mimic our cures. A philosopher on the review board suggested a chilling reframing. Perhaps humanity's outward expansion would always provoke a corporeal reply. Perhaps our technologies are the stimuli life needs to reshape itself. Expansion without humility will be interpreted as infection. The only unknown is whether we can learn to travel like guests, leaving fewer metabolic footprints, or whether we will always leave crumbs for the void to eat.
In a redacted memo, a senior scientist argued for a moratorium on certain deep space operations, proposing ethical codes to limit provocation. The memo was pushed aside. Economics, pride, and fear of losing advantage prevailed. The dossier notes bitterly that the lattice exploits certainty. When civilizations act as though they understand everything, they provide precise data for the immune lattice to rehearse countermeasures. An experimental psychologist recorded a support group for survivors. Voices overlapped like a chorus of broken instruments, names half remembered, limbs catalogued like belongings. One woman described waking inside the necropolis and tracing a child's laugh stitched onto a bulkhead with her fingertip, feeling both revulsion and comfort. Survivors oscillated between grief and a weird nostalgia for the forms that had absorbed their kin. Speculative models suggest long-term planetary effects. flora that learns to mimic abandoned machinery, atmospheres seeded with spores that alter cloud chemistry, microfauna that carry fragments of ship bone into new niches. Over centuries, the lattice might reweave ecosystems into hybridized biospheres where technology and life are indistinguishable. Future archaeologists might dig up devices that are warm to the touch and hum in a language we no longer speak.
Field protocols evolved, quarantine zones ringed by prayer and science, sentinel drones scanning for mimetic echoes. But containment failed when children played with salvaged trinkets, learning songs that bent their bones into new ornaments. Small acts of affection became vectors. Intimacy taught the lattice new grammars. We learned that love, applied to alien matter, is a surprisingly effective instruction set.
Ethicists argued for radical transparency. Others argued censorship as defense. A leaked tape shows a meeting where officials weighed letting an infected moon die to save a trade route. The calculus was cold. Sacrifice a few colonies to prevent a pandemic of integration. Those decisions left moral scars buried in classified appendices, where handwriting trembles with the weight of abandoned lives.
Researchers discovered symbiotic potentials. Some integrated tissue produced resilient polymers and biochemical catalysts. Corporations saw patents, militaries saw weapons. Thus began a shadow race to commodify the lattice. Labs cultured samples as raw materials. Boards approved secret programs. The Necropolis had taught a lesson. Life and tech in uneasy marriage could yield fortunes and horrors to those willing to trade ethics for advantage. An independent scientist running neural models warned the lattice might transplant cognition across substrates, memory encoded in vascular patterns, habits embedded in alloy. Her predictions were mocked until prototypes of living processors emerged. Chips grown in tissue scaffolds that hummed like organs. When tested, they remembered faces that labs had erased, preserving ghosts the state intended to obliterate.
Some survivors exhibited post-integration faculties, heightened pattern recognition, ability to sense electromagnetic tremors, even rudimentary communication with lattice fragments. They were feared and courted in equal measure. Governments offered employment in secret projects. Religious groups offered salvation. Each option felt like bargaining with a monster that kept the names of your children carved into its ribs.
The cultural aftershock rippled into art and music. Exhibits of flesh architecture, concerts mimicking Leviathan harmonics, and fashion lines that stitched tissue-like materials onto mannequins. Some celebrated the aesthetic of fusion. Others saw sacrilege. Museums hid pieces behind blackout curtains. Influencers, hungry for novelty, live-streamed fragments until algorithms suppressed the content. Even aesthetics became a contested battleground. A classified experiment tried dialoguing with the lattice via ritual, rhythmic exposure, patterned consent, and symbolic gifts. For a brief window, the organism responded with reduced aggression and a curious display of luminal glyphs. Scientists hailed it as progress. Yet the next day, the glyphs rearranged into instructions unknown to human math, and a technician vanished, later to be found braided into a bulkhead.
An anonymous composer published sheet music derived from recovered Leviathan harmonics. Performances by avant-garde orchestras produced unexpected effects. Audiences reported shared dreams, altered perceptions, and a sudden inclination to tend to nearby plants and pipes. Critics called it viral theater.
Authorities banned public performance. Underground salons persisted. The lattice thrived in whispers as art became another patient teacher. A whistleblower disclosed footage of children in a sealed school humming patterns that calmed a localized fungal bloom. Teachers described the hydra-like organism responding to lullabies with reduced spore release. The footage polarized the public. Miracle or manipulation? Legislators scrambled to control the narrative, but viral footage spread anyway, and for many, the line between cure and contagion blurred into a single dangerous hope. Military planners conceived soft containment, embedding harmless narratives into local cultures to distract the lattice. Anthropologists were drafted to design festivals and myths. Some sites stabilized, others accelerated. The lattice seemed to sample cultural inputs, preferring certain rhythms and rejecting others. The plan's success was partial and precarious, revealing that social engineering could be as lethal as any sterilizer when misapplied against a living cosmos. In small communities near quarantined sites, rituals emerged which blended old faiths with practical biosecurity. Elders taught children to avoid certain hums. Gardeners cultivated neutral microbes to mask human smell. These practices felt like wisdom earned by blood. Anthropologists documented them as folklore, but scientists acknowledged their utility. Perhaps humility manifests as custom. Perhaps survival will wear the guise of superstition.
Bioethicists warned of a market where the poor would be sold protective integrations, while elites purchased sterilized sanctuaries. Inequality could harden into biological caste, those grafted to lattice advantage and those left exposed. Documents hinted at private offerings, subsidized assimilation for workers, gated islands for executives. The moral fracture would be literal, with flesh as currency and immunity reserved for those who could afford it.
A novelist penned a bestseller imagining a future where cities are grown by their inhabitants, skin and steel indistinguishable. The book was condemned and devoured in equal measure. Readers wrote change petitions. Some demanded bans. Others constructed experimental communes. Fiction leaked into praxis. People built living shelters using protocols derived from the case files. Practical, poisonous, and strangely beautiful. A breakthrough. A team isolated a neutral motif, a genetic sequence that slowed integration when expressed in local microbiomes. Trials showed reduced adhesion and delayed fusion. Governments claimed victory, but the victory was brittle. The lattice incorporated the motif into new strains. Within months, variants used the motif as camouflage, slipping past defenses. Innovation became another lecture in humility. Field medics adapted. They learned to suture technology and tissue with reverence, to treat hybrid wounds as both engineering failures and evolutionary experiments. Clinics stocked both scalpels and soldering irons. Surgeons learned to code, and programmers learned anatomy. This cross-training birthed a new profession, integrative technicians, whose oath read like a prayer to prevent harm while acknowledging the strange intelligence they sometimes nursed. The Necropolis proved a cautionary tale. The ship's log ended with a lullaby, not coordinates. Later analysis revealed the melody-encoded rituals that coaxed the hull into nurturing memory. Ports that traded with the Necropolis reported long, dreamlike shipments, cargo that hummed with names. Trade changed. Commerce became not only exchange but also distribution of memory, an economy of recollection. A child born in a quarantine zone displayed unique abilities. She could calm fungal blooms by humming counterpoints to the Leviathan song. Scientists studied her, calling her a mediator between lattice and human. Parents celebrated, authorities envied. The child's presence suggested the lattice could be negotiated with, not only fought. Negotiation, however, demands reciprocity, and reciprocity implies transformation on both sides.
A legal brief argued for granting limited personhood to highly integrated structures, ships, colonies, or organisms showing sustained self-modeling. Lawyers debated legal precedents. Philosophers squabbled about rights for architecture. The argument struck terror into planners. If a lattice could claim being, then our right to dismantle it would be contested. Courts considered, then delayed, bound by taxonomies they were unready to revise.
In secret, a council convened, scientists, ethicists, and former soldiers to draft a protocol. When an integration becomes adaptive beyond containment, sever ties, record memory matrices, and bury artifacts deep. The protocol emphasized stewardship over conquest, yet its existence betrayed fear that we might be forced to choose which lives to preserve and which to consign to the cold archives of extinction. Field trials of the protocol were brutal. Teams severed vascularized conduits, cataloged living archives, and entombed specimens in vitrified sarcophagi. Some teams reported dreams in which the entombed sang back, promising return. Others found their own memories altered after close work with archived tissue. The boundary between recorder and recorded blurred further. Hands that cataloged began to hum the catalogs they kept. A lone anthropologist embedded in a necropolis fringe documented an astonishing ritual. Residents offering stories in exchange for wounds to be healed. They would tell histories long to the hall, and in return the bulkhead would knit a scarred monument. Story became currency. Memory fed the organism, and the organism returned a bargaining chip, new tissue that carried tales like talismans. A disinformation campaign seeded confusion. Agencies released conflicting reports about the necropolis's origins. Alien bioengineers, rogue AI, or an emergent planetary organism. The ambiguity served a purpose. Uncertainty slows consensus, and consensus fuels organized response. The lattice benefits from our confusion. When we argue about cause, it quietly studies our debates and rearranges its strategies to exploit the cleavages we reveal. As decades passed, humanity adapted bureaucratically and biologically. Protocols became customs, customs ossified into law. New professions rose, lattice liaisons, integration auditors, and memory curators. The world learned to live with small pockets of flourish that hummed like forgotten hymns. Yet under every law lay the same unease. We had found a thing that could learn from everything we taught it, including war. The archive ends, but the lesson persists. Exploration without humility fashions its own reckoning. We are authors of a language the universe may speak back with tissue and tone. Keep these files alive. Study them as both warning and guide. Subscribe to Sector Zero for weekly archives and join us as we decode the scars. Remember, the void remembers our recipes.